The Young and the Restless spoilers. Connor's return from Baltimore was supposed to feel transitional rather than seismic. A quiet re-entry into a familiar space that would allow him to recalibrate after months away. Yet the moment he stepped back into his old room, the air felt altered in a way he could not immediately name. The walls still held the same muted color Chelsea had chosen years ago in an attempt to create calm where there had once been chaos, but the calm now felt staged, almost artificial. Like a set left behind after the actors had gone home. As Connor began sorting through old boxes and forgotten drawers, he was struck by an unfamiliar sense of displacement. As if the room no longer fully belonged to him or had never truly done so in the first place. Each object he touched carried a memory that felt incomplete, fragments of life he had lived without understanding the larger narrative that framed it. That quiet unease sharpened into something more insistent the deeper he went, until it no longer felt like restlessness, but rather the instinctive warning of someone standing on the edge of a truth that had been deliberately concealed. It was not curiosity that led him to the box, but accident, the kind that feels orchestrated in retrospect. Tucked away in a place no one would think to look hidden behind winter coats and old luggage Chelsea never used anymore was a small, time-worn container wrapped in fabric that had faded with age. The care with which it had been hidden unsettled Connor more than the box itself, because it spoke of intention rather than neglect. When he opened it, he was met not with keepsakes meant to preserve joy, but with remnants of fear disguised as nostalgia. A photograph, slightly bent at the corners, fell into his hands first, followed by a folded letter yellowed with age, its edges softened by repeated handling. What froze Connor in place was not merely the existence of these items, but the name written in a hurried, almost desperate scrawl Clark, accompanied by a note that read less like a memory and more like a warning, as though Chelsea had been trying to remind herself of something she dared not forget. The words Connor read did not provide clarity so much as they opened a chasm beneath him. The letter was not explicit, but its subtext screamed of secrecy and dread, of a woman terrified that the past she had buried might one day resurface with consequences she could no longer control. Chelsea's handwriting revealed more than the words themselves, lines pressed too hard into the paper, sentences trailing off as if she had been afraid to finish the thought. It spoke of a man who was not just absent, but dangerous, of a truth that had to be protected at all costs, not for her sake alone, but for a child who could never be allowed to know. Connor felt the world tilt as the implication settled in with horrifying inevitability. Matt Clark was not a ghost from Chelsea's past in the abstract, but potentially the missing piece of his own identity, the father whose absence had never been fully explained because the explanation itself was too volatile to risk. The shock did not arrive as a single moment of realization, but as a cascade, each thought compounding the last until Connor's sense of self felt fractured. Every memory of his childhood began to rearrange itself around this new possibility. Questions he had never thought to ask now demanding answers with brutal urgency. The man he had believed to be his father dissolved into uncertainty, replaced by the looming specter of someone whose name alone carried weight enough to instill fear in his mother years later. Connor understood instinctively that this was not simply about biology, but about inheritance in its most dangerous form, the inheritance of secrets, patterns, and unresolved violence. The idea that Matt Clark could be his biological father did more than upend his understanding of where he came from. It destabilized his perception of who he was allowed to become. Confronting Chelsea was inevitable, though Connor delayed it for hours, pacing the room as if movement alone might rearrange the facts into something less threatening. When he finally stood before her, the weight of the discovery hung between them like a loaded weapon neither of them knew how to disarm. Connor did not accuse her at first. He demanded honesty, a full accounting of a truth that had been denied to him for reasons he could no longer accept at face value. His voice, though steady, carried the unmistakable edge of fear, not only of the man whose name he had found, but of the realization that his own mother had chosen silence over transparency, protection over trust. He needed to know if Matt Clark was truly his father, and more importantly, why Chelsea had believed the truth was something that could destroy him. As Connor spoke, it became clear that his fear extended beyond identity into the realm of immediate danger. He was no longer asking abstract questions about lineage. He was confronting the possibility that Matt Clark's reemergence was not hypothetical but imminent. Connor articulated what Chelsea had tried to suppress for years, that a man capable of inspiring such lasting dread was not someone who stayed buried forever. The idea that Matt could exploit the situation, manipulate circumstances, or use Connor himself as leverage terrified him in a way that felt visceral and uncontrollable. He demanded that Chelsea protect him, not with reassurances or half-truths, but with action, insisting that whatever measures were necessary had to be taken now, before the past could reach forward and claim them both. Chelsea's response was unraveling in real time, panic flickering behind her eyes as she struggled to maintain composure in the face of a reckoning she had long feared. She attempted to soothe Connor with explanations that felt rehearsed and incomplete, insisting that everything she had done had been for his safety. That secrecy had been her only defense against a man who thrived on chaos and control. Yet even as she spoke, Connor could sense the fragility beneath her words, the cracks forming where certainty should have been. Her reassurances rang hollow not because they lacked emotion, but because they carried the unmistakable weight of someone still hiding something. Someone who had never fully escaped the shadow she claimed to have outrun. The trust between them, once assumed to be unbreakable, now hovered on the brink of collapse. Connor saw his mother not only as a protector, but as a gatekeeper who had decided unilaterally which truths he was allowed to bear. Chelsea, in turn, faced the devastating realization that her silence had not shielded Connor from harm, but had instead delayed it, concentrating its impact into a single, explosive moment. The secret she had guarded for so long had not remained dormant. It had grown more dangerous with time, gathering power precisely because it had been denied the light of understanding. In that moment, both mother and son understood that the past was no longer content to remain a cautionary tale had become an active threat. One that endangered not just their relationship, but the fragile future they had tried so desperately to build. By the time the confrontation ended, nothing had been resolved, only exposed. Connor retreated with more questions than answers, carrying a fear that no longer belonged solely to Chelsea's history but had embedded itself within his own sense of vulnerability. Chelsea was left standing in the aftermath, haunted by the knowledge that the secret she had believed she was strong enough to carry alone had finally reached the one person she had sworn to protect from it. The bond between them, though not broken, had been irreversibly altered, stretched thin by a truth that refused to stay contained. And somewhere beyond their immediate awareness, the name Matt Clark no longer existed as a memory or a warning, but as a presence poised to transform fear into reality, threatening to claim a place in Connor's life whether either of them was ready or not. The hours that followed did not soften the blow of the truth. Instead, they stretched it into something slow and corrosive, a silence that pressed down on both Connor and Chelsea with equal cruelty. Connor withdrew into himself, moving through the house as though it no longer belonged to him. Every familiar corner now echoing with the possibility that his life had been built on a foundation deliberately altered. The discovery did not fade into shock alone. It evolved into a constant, low-level vigilance, the kind that comes when fear becomes intellectual rather than instinctive. He began replaying moments from his childhood with a new lens, searching for signs he might have missed, for gaps that suddenly felt intentional rather than coincidental. The absence of a father figure no longer registered as a tragedy softened by time, but as an omission engineered for survival. And that realization carried a weight Connor had never been asked to carry before. Chelsea, meanwhile, found herself trapped between past and present, unable to fully exist in either. The careful version of herself she had constructed over the year scammer, more grounded, seemingly transparent, began to fracture under the pressure of Connor's awareness. She understood, with a clarity that was almost paralyzing, that the story she had told herself for so long was no longer sufficient. She had believed that secrecy was a form of love, that withholding the truth was an act of protection rather than control. But Connor's reaction exposed the uncomfortable reality that protection, without consent, is simply another form of betrayal. Each time she tried to speak to him again, to offer context or reassurance, she could sense the invisible barrier that had formed. A quiet skepticism that suggested her words no longer carried the authority they once did. Connor's fear soon shifted from abstract dread into something more actionable. He began asking questions not just about Matt Clark's past, but about his present, pressing Chelsea for details she had avoided even thinking about for years. Was Matt still alive? Did he know about Connor? Had he ever tried to make contact before? Chelsea's hesitation in answering these questions only deepened Connor's anxiety, because silence now felt like confirmation rather than uncertainty. The possibility that Matt Clark might already be aware of him, watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to step back into their lives, became a fixation Connor could not dismiss. What terrified him most was not the idea of meeting his biological father, but the sense that he could be used, manipulated, or weaponized in a conflict he never chose to inherit. Chelsea's internal panic escalated as she recognized the shift in Connor's fear from emotional to strategic. This was no longer a child reacting to a shocking revelation. This was someone trying to assess threat levels, to anticipate danger, to demand safeguards that Chelsea herself had never fully put in place. She realized with painful clarity that she had relied too heavily on distance and time as defenses, convincing herself that Matt Clark belonged to a closed chapter rather than an unresolved one. The truth was that she had never truly ensured Connor's safety from Matt. She had merely postponed the confrontation by hiding the evidence of it. And now that the barrier had been breached, she could no longer pretend that avoidance was enough. The tension between them reached a new, quieter stage, one defined not by confrontation, but by mistrust. Connor began questioning decisions Chelsea made in real time, scrutinizing her choices for signs of omission or manipulation. He listened more than he spoke, observing her reactions with a precision that unsettled her, as though he were recalibrating his understanding of who she was and what she was capable of withholding. Chelsea sensed this shift acutely, the way one senses a fracture in a structure long before it collapses. She wanted to insist that she was still the same mother, still his ally. But the words felt insufficient in the face of a truth that had proven her capable of rewriting his reality without his consent. At night, Connor found sleep elusive. The house creaked with ordinary sounds that now felt charged with meaning, every unexpected noise feeding the fear that Matt Clark's return was not merely theoretical. He imagined scenarios he could not fully articulate, each one ending with the same conclusion, that his existence was no longer anonymous. The idea that his identity might matter to someone like Matt not as a son, but as leverage filled him with a cold, focused dread. Connor understood that if Matt Clark was capable of destabilizing Chelsea to this degree even in absence, his presence could unravel far more than secrets. It could dismantle the fragile sense of safety Connor had relied on his entire life. Chelsea, too, was haunted by sleeplessness, but hers was driven by guilt rather than fear alone. She replayed every decision she had made after Connor's birth, every moment she had chosen silence over honesty, and began to see them not as isolated acts of protection, but as part of a larger pattern of control rooted in her own unresolved trauma. Matt Clark had not only shaped her past through fear, he had dictated her future choices by existing as a threat she believed she could never fully escape. The realization that Connor was now carrying a portion of that burden shattered the narrative she had used to justify her actions. She had not protected Connor from Matt, she had simply ensured that when the truth surfaced, it would do so without preparation or support. The fragile equilibrium between mother and son was finally disrupted when Connor made a declaration that Chelsea had both anticipated and dreaded. He could not continue living in uncertainty. He needed to know what Chelsea was willing to do now, not what she wished she had done years ago. He needed assurances grounded in reality, not promises built on hope. Connor's demand was not dramatic, but it was resolute. He wanted a plan, a strategy, a way forward that acknowledged Matt Clark as a real and present danger rather than a shadow best ignored. In that moment, Chelsea understood that the power dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. Connor was no longer a passive recipient of her protection. He was insisting on agency, even if that meant confronting the very threat she had spent years trying to outrun. Chelsea's fear crystallized into something sharper as she recognized the implications of Connor's resolve. Addressing Matt Clark directly, taking steps to ensure he could not re-enter their lives unchecked, meant reopening wounds she had barely survived the first time. Yet refusing to act now would only confirm Connor's worst fears that she was still prioritizing avoidance over safety, comfort over truth. The past, once contained in a hidden box, had expanded to occupy every corner of their present, demanding decisions neither of them felt fully equipped to make. As Chelsea finally acknowledged that silence was no longer an option, she was forced to confront a devastating truth of her own. Protecting Connor now might require facing the man she had built her entire life around escaping. And the cost of that confrontation was something she could no longer calculate alone. By the end of that night, the future they had both assumed was no longer intact. Connor stood on the threshold of a new understanding of himself, one defined as much by uncertainty as by determination. While Chelsea faced the collapse of a carefully maintained illusion that love alone could neutralize danger. The secret had done its damage, not by being revealed, but by exposing how unprepared they were to face its consequences together. And as the name Matt Clark lingered unspoken yet omnipresent between them, it became clear that his return, whether imminent or inevitable, would not simply test their bond, but redefine it entirely, forcing both mother and son to confront the possibility that survival might demand more than silence ever could.